All right. Hopefully everyone can see that all right. So thanks so much for having me tonight. Um, and to Jesse for hosting this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the perspective from us of the Oregon Coastal Management Program on sea level rise on the Oregon coast and some resources we've recently developed to help local communities address this issue, and a specific project that we have focused in Clatsop County right now. So yeah, please feel free to put questions in throughout the process, and I'm happy to continue to discuss at the end as well. So Jesse talked about a little bit already, but so I work for the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, which is the lead administrator for Oregon's Coastal Zone Management Program. And that is a federally approved program, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a voluntary partnership between the federal government and the coastal states and territories throughout the United States. And all of our coastal states, including the Great Lakes states and Gulf Coast states, participate in this program except for Alaska. And this was a program that was established by the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972. And it was really because as all of you know, the coasts are very important for lots of reasons to the federal government. It's where a lot of people live. It's where there are high concentrations of populations. There's a lot of economic activity through ports and channels and things like that. There's also security interest from a national defense point of view. And then, of course, there's really important and dynamic and sensitive ecosystems. So the federal government was really interested in having some say over the coastal environment, but the states are really the ones that have that control. So this partnership was set up where the federal government actually gives money to coastal states who have this coastal zone management program, as long as those states meet minimum requirements. And then in turn, the states get money, but also flexibility to do coastal zone management within their own frameworks. And also they get something called federal consistency review, which I'm not really going to talk about tonight, but is a very powerful tool that states have to review federal actions and activities that take place in the coastal zone. So in Oregon, our coastal zone is roughly the crest of the coast range out to the edge of our territorial sea, which is 3 nautical miles from the coastline. And it's that dark green and dark blue area that's mapped here in the center of the slide. And that's a watershed-based approach, which is pretty unique. For example, in California, the coastal zone is just the coastal strip along the shoreline. So we have much broader authority. And so all of the cities and counties that are within this boundary, as well as all the state agencies that have permitting authority or interest in this boundary, are all a part of our Oregon Coastal Management Program. And all of their authorities and programs are also part of that. And so we do have a pretty large network because of that. We have 22 major estuaries, actually we have 8 counties and 34 cities. So I have to update my slide because it does include Columbia County and the city of Vernonia, which might not seem like coastal areas, but they actually are still part of the watershed for the coastal zone. And so all of those are part of our networked program. And not only is our Coastal Zone Management Program a networked program, but so is our statewide land use planning system, which you also might be familiar with. This was a pretty unique system of land use that is still unique among the states. And it was implemented in 1973. And we're actually celebrating the 50th anniversary of the signing of Senate Bill 100 this year for the statewide land use planning program, and we'll be celebrating all year, as well as looking at our challenges and opportunities for the future. And so what this really set out was a framework in which there are coordinated goals that are sort of at the high level, state level, that all cities and counties and state agencies that are related to land use have to be in compliance with. And those are the 19 statewide planning goals listed here on the left-hand side. And they cover all sorts of topics from citizen involvement, energy conservation, transportation, forest land, agricultural land, and then the last 4 are coastal resource specific. So there's goal 16 on estuarine resources, goal 17 coastal shorelands, goal 18 beaches and dunes, and goal 19 ocean resources. So those are the ones that our coastal zone management program here at DLCD really focus on. And again, it's a bottom-up approach where the cities and counties are implementing these provisions through their comprehensive plans and land use ordinances, and then through things like land use compatibility statements, through permitting authorities at like Department of State Lands for removal fill areas, or on the ocean shore through the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department through their ocean shoreline alteration program. So all of those things have to still be in compliance with those 19 planning goals. So zooming into those coastal ones specifically, here's just a simple drawing of how those goals look on the landscape. So the estuary is really in the estuary waters. The shorelands are the adjacent uplands of estuaries, as well as the ocean shore and any coastal lakes and rivers. And then beaches and dunes are the sandy parts, along our coastline on the ocean front. And then, of course, from the coast out to 3 nautical miles. And in some cases beyond that, includes our ocean resources under Goal 19. So that's really kind of where our framework lies, but now turning sort of to how that all fits into our efforts to tackle and to target climate change here at DLCD. And we have lots of different programs that are sort of addressing this issue in various ways. And so, we kind of think about it in 3 main buckets. There's mitigation, which means trying to reduce our overall greenhouse gas pollution. Then there's adaptation, which is like we're already having effects of climate change. So how do we adapt to those impacts? And then there's sequestration, which is trying to remove greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. And we have a lot of lands that do that naturally in Oregon. And so just trying to encourage that. I'm really going to focus on the adaptation part tonight. That's really where I'm focused, but we do have staff who are working on all of those aspects of climate change. So for sea level rise, it's already starting to happen in Oregon. It's definitely one of those kinds of climate impacts that maybe some people don't really think about affecting us in Oregon, because we have tectonic uplift, which has been kind of keeping pace or outpacing sea level rise in the past, but that's starting to change. So we are starting to see that there is some more sea level rise happening now, and it will continue to speed up as we go into the future. And it's really uncertain what the exact amounts will be and by when, because we don't really know what our emission scenarios will be into the future. It's kind of up to all of us and our policies and our behavior changes of whether we are going to continue to emit a lot of greenhouse gases or to start to curb that emissions. So this graph shows for the Newport tide gauge, which is on the central Oregon coast, sort of where we're at with future projections of sea level rise. And they're color coded by those different emission scenarios. So if you looked at the intermediate, which is sort of that teal color in the middle, you can see that it goes from about a half a foot in 2040 to about almost 3 feet by 2100. And it goes all the way from 6 feet on the very high end to like just under a foot on the low end. So it can really vary quite a lot. The central coast is where we expect to have the greatest sea level rise. On the north and the south coast, we still have greater tectonic uplift in those regions, and that will continue. So the projections for sea level rise in those areas will be a little bit lower, but it will still potentially be challenging. And so I saw a question about uplift. I apologize that I didn't go into more detail. So that's the Cascadia subduction zone is off of our coast, and that is pushing. So the Juan de Fuca plate is pushing under the North American plate. And so we are actually rising a little bit every year. And then of course we know that once there is a major earthquake, we will subside quite substantially and very quickly. So we could go down 3 to 7 feet whenever that kind of event occurs. And then we'll have sea level rise very quickly. But for the more chronic type of sea level rise, this is sort of our projections. And these projections do incorporate tectonic uplift rates into them. So these rates are very specific to Oregon, as you can see here. So they're hopefully you can sort of walk through this graph. You know, there's 2040, 2070, and 2100 timeframes here, and each of the 3 columns shows low emission scenario, intermediate, and then high emission scenarios. So if we kind of take the middle approach, you can see like in Astoria, it's 0.2 feet by 2040, 0.8 feet by 2070, and 2.26 feet by 2100. So you can just sort of walk across the columns and see the range that we might expect. And so what does that actually mean on the ground? You know, we already have a lot of coastal hazards, which I'm sure is no surprise to all of you. We have really large winter waves and storms on the Oregon coast. We have one of the most energetic winter wave climates in the world. And so we do have already very large erosion and storm impacts, and those will continue to get worse over time with sea level rise because water will be coming to the back of the beach more often, and really just continuing to erode those dunes and bluffs and beaches and structures. Whatever's in the way, it will continue to erode those areas. The same is true of flooding. This happens more often in our estuary areas, but certainly on the outer coast as well, where we already experience coastal flooding from riverine or from ocean inputs. And if you have higher sea levels, then the tidal influence goes up higher, and the flooding impacts can become more frequent or can impact more landward than they have before. So those are some of the main impacts that we expect. There are some other secondary impacts as well, but I wanted to kind of switch gears to talking about some of the new resources that we've developed at DLCD recently to try to help our local communities figure out how to adapt to these impacts of sea level rise within our current regulatory framework. So we developed a toolkit that was recently published for public consumption this past fall. And so the first piece of the toolkit is this sea level rise impact viewer. So it's an online mapping tool, and you can see the URL that's pasted at the bottom of the screen here, the coastalatlas.net/sea level rise. This is where you can find all 3 of the tools that I'm going to talk about tonight. And this is, it's a conglomeration of a few different data sources that we have access to right now to try to look at not only sea level rise, but also total water levels. So that's really what we care about when we're thinking about the impacts of sea level rise, is not just, you know, a bathtub model of just the sea level rise on top of static water, but also when you have flooding events or big storm surge, and erosion events, like what are those additional water factors that really start to have the major impacts in areas. So this is a screenshot in the Seaside Gearhart area on the north coast. The pink area is the water levels, the sea level rise planning area, basically. And there are different levels of pink depending on which hazard that data is coming from. So just the lightest pink is just one hazard. So that's usually just erosion or flooding. The next level pink is 2 hazards. So that would be where they overlap, where you might have erosion and flooding. And then the 3 hazards is where you have sea level rise, flooding and erosion happening, because we actually don't have sea level rise data included in the outer coast data sets, although it sort of is conservatively built in because of the erosion zones that we have for these areas, and it's the velocity zone for flooding. So it is pretty high water that we're putting out there in this event. And it's for the estuaries where we do have sea level rise data, it's a 1.5 foot sea level rise plus a 1% chance flood scenario. So it's like a 1 in 100 year event. So it'd be a pretty big event. So we're really trying with this viewer, trying to show areas that would be impacted by big events because it really helps to plan for those areas. And sort of with that data, we try to show some other impacted assets, excuse me, wherever we have coast-wide data. So you can see there on the right-hand side, that's the legend for the viewer. And so you can see wastewater treatment facilities, water intake, law enforcement, hospital, heliport, fire station, and so on. Roads, railroads, things like that, that could be impacted, and it would make a difference if they were impacted. Here's another screenshot that I just want to show more zoomed in, and that if you click on any of these polygons, it gives you the data source, so you can go see the data for yourself, and it talks about which hazards are impacting that area. So it's helpful to kind of get a little bit more into the data if that's of interest to those who are using it. And here's just another one from Yaquina Bay. So this one is a little bit more into the estuary. And so you can see this is the 1.5 foot sea level rise plus 1% chance flood. So now we have this data. That's sort of like step one in our minds of just trying to see what is at risk from the impacts of sea level rise for a community. And we're trying really to couch it as not a time series. Like, we're not saying like this is going to happen by 2100 or 2070 or whatever. It's more thinking about what is there and potentially impacted, and how adaptive is it, and how could we make it more adaptive. So trying to just think about when the water becomes impactful, what do we do about it? So that's sort of the next tool that we developed, which is a impact assessment spreadsheet. And so it's just a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet that we developed that has calculations sort of built into it. And it just has a series of drop-down windows that you can put in the affected assets. It can be both places as well as population. So if there's, say, a school where there's young children and that is a vulnerable population, we can also put in things like that. So the sort of I've put the main buckets in on this slide of the spreadsheet, because looking at a spreadsheet is not very interesting. But the first sort of series of tabs is about the exposure. So is this something that's exposed to 1, 2, or 3 hazards? So corresponding to that mapping tool that I just walked through. Then sort of the asset classification, is it like a hospital where there's high human life safety element, or is it like a culvert or a bridge? Or a church or something else? And then you can talk about its sensitivity to harm. So is it something that is likely to be impacted by erosion or flooding? And what is its adaptive capacity to overcome that and cope with that? And then we sort of add that all up, and then also have this category for social weighting, which is something that can be done through a public process, where the public can weigh in and say how important different assets are to them and their functioning in the community to continue to have a say in the total vulnerability score of the area. And what we hope is that at the end of this, I'll skip ahead one slide so you can see that you end up having a list of these exposed assets and a vulnerability score, which is a qualitative score, but it really helps areas that are already under capacity, like they're low staff, and having to deal with the crises of the day, but this is long-term planning and it's hard to do. And so this sort of highlights the things that need immediate attention and things that might not need immediate attention or might already have the ability to adapt. So it really kind of helps to say, if we're only going to have a few resources, where are we going to put them first? So this is just, a make-believe example of things listed here just for example purposes. And you can see with this red, where the score is 17 for helping hand assisted living, like this is a place that might need attention. It's very impacted by sea level rise, and a lot of people depend on it. And it provides services for underserved populations and so on. So it's a place that needs attention for adaptation. So I just wanted to kind of use the example of a culvert near a medical facility to kind of walk through what we would think about. It's a very simple example, but it's certainly something that is realistic. Culverts and water infrastructure is certainly one of the things that will be really impacted by sea level rise in communities. So you could, again, walk through this, that exercise of like, is it exposed to 1, 2, or 3 hazards? What is the risk category? Is it served by underserved and well-served population? What is the damage likely? Is it prepared to cope? And how important is it to the community? Is there a detour route? Is there no detour route? And then the third tool of our toolkit is a guidebook. And this contains a catalog of adaptation strategies that once you sort of have a prioritized list of impacted areas, you could then think about what is your approach to adaptation for these. And this guidebook is specific to Oregon and our policy framework. It does talk a little bit about our policy framework and how sea level rise is couched within that. And then it kind of gives some different buckets of strategies to think through. So those are listed here: planning a policy. So is there some changes to zoning that can be done to help make places more adaptive? Design and building codes. So just, for example, building a foot above freeboard for places that are prone to flooding, outreach and education types of approaches. There's sort of like the typical kinds of thoughts that people think of when they think of sea level rise adaptation, which is protect, accommodate, restore. So like putting up beachfront protective structures or moving a house back on a lot, or restoring the floodplain of restoring wetlands and restoring the floodplain so that it has flood storage. Then we have some things about tax incentives and sort of financial structures that could be considered to pay for some of these things or to incentivize them. And then realignment, which is the most difficult one of all, which is actually just moving structures and infrastructure away from the shoreline over time. So those are all kind of a broad overview of some of the things that we talk about, but the guide, goes into a bit more detail on each of those. And we are trying to couch it as something that, like, if one strategy feels very unpalatable at this point in time, then it's okay. You don't need to do it. You can do something else that feels a little more palatable for the community. So it's meant to be, like I said, a catalog, a menu of options, so that you can sort of pick and choose which ones work best for each community individually. So in the case of our culvert for medical clinics, some things that are options that you could consider: widening the culvert, replacing it with a bridge, reducing or diverting the water through floodplain restoration, or do nothing. And that's sort of always a good something to think about, and which helps to highlight the need to do some adaptation, because doing nothing is also a strategy, whether you want it to be or not. And so really what we're hoping is that at the end of the day, that there's a sea level rise action plan. If you go through all of these steps and utilize these tools, then you would have, a prioritized list of things to do to adapt, a project list, potential funding options, policy and administrative changes to make, partners to reach out to or build, timelines of when this could become problematic, and how to be proactive, and other things to think about. So that's our hope with it. Again, these are new tools and we haven't seen it through yet, but we are starting that piloting right now with a NOAA Coastal Management Fellowship. We have someone working with us now for the next 2 years. His name is Carl Hendrickson, and he is working specifically with Clatsop County to implement these sea level rise tools and test them out and see how they go, and capture lessons learned and how we can adapt these tools, because we really do feel like these are living resources that will continue to be adapted over time as we learn what works and what doesn't, because this is sort of for all of us throughout the country and the world. This is unprecedented times, and we are experimenting a little bit. This is us trying to figure out how to do this, and we might sometimes get it wrong, and then we have to go back and change and adapt and learn from that. So that's what we're doing now, is we're sort of learning how these things will work in a community. It's focused in Clatsop County, with the county itself, with the city of Cannon Beach, and with Fort Stevens State Park. We're hoping, we're starting to gear up for a robust community outreach and engagement. The next slide, we'll talk a little bit about those community workshops, doing some sea level rise vulnerability assessments, so using the viewer and the impact assessment spreadsheet, and then identifying the sea level rise adaptation action strategies for each of those communities, which will really give, which will be very different for each of those areas, because they are different in their populations, their geographies, their assets, and things like that. So each of those will be tailored to their specific areas. So here are the upcoming community workshops that Carl will be leading in March in Clatsop County area. So it's going to start in the Seaside Convention Center on March 11th, and then go to Arch Cape, Cannon Beach, Lewis and Clark, and Brownsmead. So each of those communities will be invited to come and talk about sea level rise in their communities, what's really important to them, what do they think will be problematic in the future and will really impact their lives, so that we can try to assess where to prioritize the adaptation actions for the area. And I'll happy to answer questions or discuss further, but that's what I wanted to highlight tonight. And I'll put the mapping address in the chat so that everyone can go see those tools if they would like.